Officer Mark Reynolds had spent more than 10 years on the police force, building a reputation as someone who was both dedicated and tough when it came to keeping his community safe. He wasn't the kind of person to shy away from hard work or difficult situations. In fact, many people in his town admired him for his commitment to protecting them. But little did anyone know that one seemingly ordinary day would turn into something far beyond what anyone could have imagined. It all started on a Saturday afternoon just like any other weekend. The sun was shining brightly outside and the streets were filled with families running errands or enjoying their time off. For Mark, this particular Saturday was supposed to be no different. After finishing his shift at the station earlier that morning, he decided to stop by the local supermarket to pick up a few things before heading home. It was nothing unusual, just bread, milk, and some snacks for later. Nothing about this trip hinted at the chaos that would soon unfold. As Mark walked through the automatic doors of the store, he took a deep breath. There was something comforting about the familiar hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the faint smell of fresh produce wafting through the air. Everything seemed normal at first glance. Shoppers pushed carts down aisles, grabbing items off shelves while kids tagged along behind their parents, occasionally reaching for candy bars they hoped wouldn't get noticed until checkout. But then, something caught Mark's eye. Standing near the checkout line, there was a man who looked off. At least that's how Mark described it later. The man stood out not because he was doing anything particularly strange, but because of the way he carried himself. His movements were quick and jerky, almost nervous. Every now and then, he glanced around the room, scanning the crowd as if searching for someone, or maybe avoiding being seen altogether. To most people, this might not have raised any red flags. But for Mark, whose instincts had been honed over years of experience, it was enough to make him pause. At first, Mark tried to brush it off. Maybe the guy was just having a bad day, or perhaps he was simply distracted. People acted weird sometimes. It didn't always mean trouble was brewing. Still, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. So instead of ignoring it, he decided to take a closer look. Slowly, he began making his way toward the man, weaving between shoppers and trying not to draw attention to himself. As he got closer, he noticed even more details that made him uneasy. The man wore plain clothes, jeans, and a hoodie, but there was something calculated about the way he positioned himself. He kept glancing toward the exit as if planning an escape route. Mark's mind raced with possibilities. Was this man casing the place? Could he be involved in some sort of crime? Or worse, was he armed? These questions swirled through Mark's head as he approached cautiously. Years of training kicked in, reminding him to stay alert and prepared for anything. When he finally reached the man, Mark cleared his throat and spoke firmly. "Excuse me, sir," he said, flashing his badge briefly. "I'm Officer Reynolds. Do you mind telling me what you're doing here?" The man turned to face him, clearly startled by the sudden interruption. For a moment, neither of them said anything. They simply stared at each other, sizing each other up. Then, without warning, the tension in the air grew thicker. Instead of answering Mark's question, the man snapped back defensively. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice sharp and accusatory. "What gives you the right to ask me that?" Mark blinked, taken aback by the hostility in the man's tone. Normally, showing his badge was enough to command respect, or at least cooperation, from most people. But this guy wasn't backing down. If anything, he seemed angry, almost insulted by Mark's presence. That's when things really started to escalate. Feeling challenged, Mark instinctively placed his hand on the holster of his gun. It wasn't meant as a threat, at least not consciously, but rather as a precaution. He wanted to remind the man that he was dealing with a police officer, someone who had authority and wasn't afraid to use it if necessary. Unfortunately, this move only made matters worse. The man's eyes widened slightly, and his posture shifted. He squared his shoulders, looking like he was ready to fight back. For a brief moment, everything hung in the balance. Neither man moved, but the energy between them crackled with intensity. Shoppers nearby began to notice the standoff, whispering nervously to each other as they realized something serious was happening. A mother grabbed her child's hand and hurried away from the scene, while an elderly man froze mid-step, unsure whether to intervene or flee. Panic spread quickly, and within seconds the peaceful atmosphere of the supermarket dissolved into chaos. What happened next would become the subject of countless headlines, debates, and courtroom testimonies. But in that exact moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the decision Mark was about to make, a decision that would alter the course of his life forever. The tension between Officer Mark Reynolds and the man in the hoodie was palpable, like a storm about to break. Neither of them moved, but their eyes locked in a silent battle of wills. Shoppers around them began to scatter, sensing that something dangerous was brewing. Mothers pulled their children closer, elderly shoppers hurried toward the exits, and cashiers froze behind their counters, unsure whether to call for help or stay out of the way. The once calm supermarket had transformed into a scene of confusion and fear. Mark's hand remained close to his holster, though he hadn't drawn his weapon yet. He wasn't sure why this man was acting so defensive, but his instincts told him not to let his guard down. After years on the force, Mark had learned to trust his gut. It had saved him more times than he could count. But this time, things felt different. Something about the situation didn't add up. Why would someone react this strongly to being questioned by a police officer? Was he hiding something? Or was there another explanation? The man in the hoodie finally spoke again, his voice laced with frustration. "Look," he said sharply, "I don't know who you are or what you think you're doing, but I'm not here to cause trouble." His words were firm, but there was an edge of irritation in his tone that made Mark uneasy. Instead of calming the situation, the man's response only heightened Mark's suspicions. If he truly had nothing to hide, why was he so resistant? "Then maybe you can explain why you're standing here acting suspiciously," Mark replied, his voice steady but commanding. He took a step closer, trying to assert control over the situation. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" A split second it seemed like the man might answer. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then hesitated. Instead of responding directly, he glanced around the store again, his movements quick and deliberate. That glance sealed it for Mark. This wasn't just paranoia, the man was definitely up to something. Whether it was shoplifting, planning some kind of robbery, or something else entirely, Mark couldn't be sure. All he knew was that he needed answers, and fast. But before either of them could say anything further, the man suddenly reached toward his waistband. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but to Mark it looked like a threat. In that moment, adrenaline surged through his body, overriding logic and reason. Without thinking, he drew his gun and pointed it squarely at the man. "Don't move!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the noise of the panicked crowd. "Keep your hands where I can see them!" The effect was immediate. The man froze, his eyes widening in shock. For a moment, everything went still, the kind of eerie silence that follows a loud bang. Then chaos erupted all over again. People screamed, ducking behind shelves or running toward the exits. A child wailed somewhere in the distance, adding to the cacophony of fear. Even the store employees abandoned their posts, fleeing to safer areas. No one wanted to be caught in the crossfire if things turned violent. What happened next unfolded in slow motion. The man slowly raised his hands above his head, palms facing outward to show he wasn't armed. "You don't understand," he said, his voice calm despite the obvious tension in the air. "I'm not who you think I am." Mark tightened his grip on the gun, his heart pounding in his chest. He'd heard those words before from suspects trying to talk their way out of trouble. Most of the time, they were lies meant to buy time or distract him. But there was something about the way this man spoke, his tone measured, almost resigned, that gave Mark pause. Still, he couldn't afford to take any chances, not when lives were potentially at stake. "I said don't move," Mark repeated, louder this time. His voice echoed through the nearly empty store, bouncing off the walls and amplifying the tension. By now, most of the shoppers had fled, leaving only a handful of brave souls peeking out from behind displays or crouched behind checkout counters. Everyone was watching, waiting to see how this standoff would end. Seconds stretched into minutes, each one feeling longer than the last. Finally, the man spoke again, his voice tinged with urgency. "Listen to me," he said, his gaze locking onto Mark's. "I'm not a criminal. I'm an FBI agent." If Mark had been holding a cup of coffee, he would have dropped it right, then and there. Those 5 words hit him like a punch to the gut, stopping him cold. FBI agent? How could that be possible? This man didn't look like any federal agent Mark had ever encountered. There was no badge, no uniform, nothing to indicate. He was anything other than an ordinary civilian, or so Mark had thought. Before Mark could respond, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Backup had arrived. Within moments, uniformed officers poured into the store, guns drawn and ready for action. They quickly surrounded the man, shouting orders for him to get down on the ground. To Mark's astonishment, the man complied without resistance, dropping to his knees and placing his hands behind his head. One of the officers approached him cautiously, frisking him for weapons, while another checked his credentials. It turned out the man was telling the truth. His name was James Carter, and he really was an FBI agent. He explained that he had been conducting undercover surveillance of a suspected criminal operation linked to organized crime. The supermarket was part of his investigation, though he hadn't expected to run into a local cop during his assignment. Unfortunately, neither of them had identified themselves properly in the heat of the moment, leading to the disastrous misunderstanding. As the reality of the situation sank in, Mark felt a wave of emotions crash over him: shock, embarrassment, anger, and even a hint of fear. What had he done? In his haste to protect the public, he had pointed a loaded weapon at a fellow law enforcement officer. The gravity of his mistake weighed heavily on him, threatening to crush him under its enormity. He realized too late that his actions weren't just reckless, they were potentially career-ending. Meanwhile, Special Agent Carter remained calm throughout the ordeal, though it was clear he wasn't pleased. As soon as he was cleared of any wrongdoing, he turned to address the officers surrounding him. "Let's get this sorted out," he said firmly. "We need to figure out exactly what happened here and make sure it doesn't happen again." By the time the dust settled, the entire incident had been recorded, not just by security cameras inside the store, but also by several bystanders who had captured the confrontation on their phones. Within hours, footage of the altercation began, circulating online, sparking outrage and debate across social media platforms. Some viewers praised Mark for his quick thinking, arguing that he was simply doing his job. Others condemned him for escalating the situation unnecessarily, pointing out that he should have asked for identification before drawing his weapon. For Mark, the aftermath was overwhelming. He was placed under arrest and charged with aggravated assault, a decision that shocked both him and his colleagues. Overnight, he went from being a respected member of the community to a headline-grabbing controversy. Friends and family rallied around him, offering support and encouragement. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he had let everyone down, including himself. As days turned into weeks, the full weight of his actions began to sink in. Mark spent countless hours replaying the events in his mind, wondering what he could have done differently. Could he have avoided pulling his gun? Should he have waited for backup instead of confronting Carter alone? These questions haunted him, gnawing at his confidence and forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own judgment and training. Little did Mark know, this was only the beginning of a long and difficult journey, one that would test his resilience, challenge his beliefs, and ultimately force him to redefine what it meant to serve and protect. By the time the police cruisers and FBI vehicles surrounded the supermarket, the scene inside had turned into a spectacle. Shoppers who hadn't fled were huddled in corners, clutching their phones as they recorded snippets of the chaos unfolding before them. Uniformed officers moved with precision, securing the area while Special Agent James Carter was being processed by his fellow agents. The air was thick with tension, and Officer Mark Reynolds stood frozen, still holding his gun pointed at Carter even as other officers began to take control of the situation. It wasn't until one of the senior officers barked an order, "Reynolds, stand down," that Mark finally lowered his weapon. His hands trembled slightly as he holstered his gun, but his face remained stoic. Inside, however, his mind was racing. He couldn't believe what had just happened. One moment he thought he was dealing with a potential threat. The next he realized he'd drawn his weapon on a federal agent. The weight of that realization pressed down on him like a ton of bricks. As the initial shock wore off, Mark tried to explain himself. "I didn't know," he stammered, addressing the senior officer who approached him. He didn't identify himself. "I thought he was suspicious. I swear I was just doing my job." The senior officer, a grizzled veteran, named Lieutenant Harris, gave Mark a hard look. "You're going to need more than that to explain this mess," he said grimly. Then, without another word, he signaled for two uniformed officers to escort Mark outside. As they led him toward the parking lot, Mark caught glimpses of the crowd gathered near the store entrance, reporters with microphones, curious onlookers, snapping photos, and worried shoppers exchanging whispers. Some stared at him with wide eyes, while others glared with obvious disdain. It was clear that word of the incident had spread quickly. Once outside, Mark was taken to a patrol car and placed under arrest. The handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, cold and unforgiving. For a man used to wearing a badge and commanding authority, sitting in the back seat of a squad car felt surreal. Every passing second seemed to stretch endlessly as his mind replayed the confrontation over and over again. How could this have happened? What would happen to him now? Meanwhile, back inside the supermarket, Special Agent Carter was already giving his side of the story to his superiors. Despite the hostility of the encounter, Carter maintained a professional demeanor, carefully recounting how the misunderstanding had escalated so quickly. "I was conducting surveillance," he explained. "I didn't expect to run into a local officer, let alone have him draw a weapon on me. Neither of us identified ourselves properly, which is why things got out of hand." Carter's calm explanation contrasted sharply with the heated reactions coming from the public. By the time news crews arrived at the scene, videos of the altercation were already circulating online. Social media exploded with opinions, dividing people into two camps: those who supported Mark for acting decisively, and those who condemned him for pointing a gun at a federal agent. Comment sections filled with vitriol, hashtags trended, and talk shows debated whether Mark's actions were justified or reckless. For Mark, the fallout was immediate and brutal. Within hours of his arrest, his name became synonymous with controversy. Reporters camped outside his home, shoving microphones into the faces of his family members whenever they stepped outside. His wife, Sarah, struggled to shield their young daughter from the barrage of questions and accusations. "He's a good man," she told anyone who would listen, her voice trembling with emotion. "He made a mistake, but he doesn't deserve this kind of treatment." Despite the support from his loved ones, Mark couldn't escape the scrutiny. His colleagues at the precinct were equally divided. Some rallied behind him, insisting that he had acted in good faith under confusing circumstances. Others distanced themselves, fearing guilt by association, or worried about how the scandal might reflect poorly on the department. Even his captain, usually a staunch defender of his officers, avoided meeting Mark's gaze during briefings. The legal process moved swiftly. Within days, Mark was formally charged with aggravated assault, a felony offense that carried serious consequences. Prosecutors argued that drawing a weapon on a federal agent constituted a grave breach of protocol and trust. Defense attorneys countered that Mark had been operating based on reasonable suspicion and lacked any intent to harm. The case quickly became a high-profile legal battle, drawing attention not only from local media, but also national outlets. The trial date approached. Public opinion remained deeply polarized. On one side, supporters of law enforcement praised Mark for his dedication and bravery, framing the incident as a tragic misunderstanding rather than malicious behavior. They pointed out that Mark had no way of knowing Carter was an FBI agent, and argued that his actions were consistent with standard police procedures. On the other side, critics accused Mark of abusing his power and endangering innocent lives through reckless conduct. They highlighted the fact that Carter had been unarmed and posed no immediate threat, questioning whether Mark's response was truly necessary. Throughout it all, Mark wrestled with a mix of emotions. Shame gnawed at him every time he saw his reflection in the mirror or heard someone call him the cop who messed up. Anger bubbled beneath the surface when he read harsh comments online or listened to pundits dissect his life. But most of all, he felt trapped, caught between the expectations placed on him as a police officer and the reality of human error. He knew he hadn't intended to cause harm, yet he couldn't deny that his actions had serious repercussions. In court, the prosecution painted a damning picture of Mark's decision-making. Witnesses testified about the panic and fear they felt during the supermarket standoff, emphasizing the danger posed by a loaded firearm in such a crowded space. Surveillance footage showed Mark drawing his weapon almost instinctively, reinforcing the argument that he had acted impulsively without gathering enough information. Meanwhile, the defense worked tirelessly to humanize Mark, presenting him as a dedicated public servant who had simply misjudged a complicated situation. Special Agent Carter took the stand as well, delivering his testimony with measured composure. While he acknowledged that Mark likely believed he was protecting the public, Carter emphasized the importance of proper identification and communication between law enforcement agencies. "We're all on the same team," he said during cross-examination. "But incidents like this undermine trust, not just among officers but with the communities we serve." As the trial progressed, Mark found himself reflecting on the broader implications of the case. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about systemic issues within policing culture. How often did similar misunderstandings occur? Could better training or clearer protocols prevent future conflicts? These questions weighed heavily on him, offering little comfort but prompting moments of introspection. Ultimately, after weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Guilty of misdemeanor assault. The judge sentenced Mark to 3 years in prison, citing the need for accountability and deterrence in cases involving law enforcement misconduct. Though shorter than the maximum penalty, the sentence felt like a lifetime to Mark. As he was led away in handcuffs, he glanced at his family in the courtroom, his wife fighting back tears, his daughter clutching a stuffed animal, and wondered if he'd ever be able to make things right. The days following the sentencing were a blur of logistical nightmares. Mark resigned from the police force, unable to face the stigma attached to his name. Friends stopped calling, neighbors avoided eye contact, and the once familiar streets of his town felt alien and unwelcoming. The world he had known for over a decade was crumbling around him, leaving him isolated and unsure of what lay ahead. Yet amid the turmoil, a small spark of determination flickered within Mark. He vowed to learn from his mistakes, no matter how painful the lessons might be. If nothing else, he hoped that sharing his story, his failure, could help others avoid the same pitfalls. After all, redemption often begins with humility, and Mark was ready to start rebuilding his life, one step at a time. The courtroom drama surrounding Officer Mark Reynolds spilled over into the public sphere, igniting a firestorm of debate that spread far beyond the walls of the courthouse. The case became a lightning rod for discussions about law enforcement practices, accountability, and the delicate balance between authority and responsibility. As news outlets dissected every detail of the incident, television anchors, radio hosts, and social media influencers weighed in with their opinions, turning what started as a local misunderstanding into a national spectacle. On one side of the divide were those who staunchly supported Mark, arguing that he had been doing exactly what police officers are trained to do: assess threats and act decisively to protect the public. These supporters pointed out that Mark couldn't have known James Carter was an FBI agent, since Carter hadn't identified himself during their confrontation. To them, the situation was a textbook example of miscommunication gone horribly wrong. "He's not a bad guy," one neighbor told reporters outside Mark's home. "He made a mistake, sure, but don't we all? Why should his life be ruined because of this?" These sentiments resonated with many people, particularly those who believed police officers faced impossible challenges daily. Some even framed Mark as a victim of circumstances, a hard-working cop caught in the crosshairs of bureaucracy and public scrutiny. Memes began circulating online showing Mark as a symbol of misunderstood heroism, while hashtags like #YYR Stand with Reynolds trended on Twitter. Supporters organized fundraisers to help cover Mark's legal fees, and petitions calling for leniency flooded email inboxes across the country. On the other side of the debate, critics argued that Mark's actions represented everything wrong with modern policing. They accused him of escalating the situation unnecessarily, pointing out that Carter had never physically threatened anyone or brandished a weapon. For these detractors, the incident underscored deeper systemic issues within law enforcement, including a lack of proper training in de-escalation techniques and poor communication protocols between agencies. What if it had been an innocent civilian instead of an FBI agent? One commentator wrote on Facebook. Would he have shot first and asked questions later then too? Television pundits seized on the controversy, hosting heated panel discussions where experts clashed over whether Mark's behavior was justified. Late-night comedians joked about the absurdity of the situation, dubbing it Cop versus G-Man, and using it as fodder for their monologues. Meanwhile, daytime talk shows invited guests ranging from former police officers to civil rights activists to weigh in on the issue. Each segment seemed to amplify the divide, with viewers growing more entrenched in their beliefs. For Mark, the constant attention was suffocating. Every time he turned on the TV or opened his phone, he saw his face plastered across screens, accompanied by headlines that reduced his life to a single moment of poor judgment. At first, he tried to ignore the noise, focusing instead on preparing for his trial and spending time with his family. But as the days dragged on, the pressure became unbearable. Strangers would stop him in public, some offering words of encouragement, others hurling insults. Even mundane tasks like grocery shopping or picking up his daughter from school felt like walking through a minefield. Sarah, Mark's wife, bore the brunt of the emotional toll. She became the unofficial spokesperson for her husband, fielding calls from reporters and defending him against accusations that she knew weren't entirely fair. "Mark is human," she told one interviewer, her voice cracking with emotion. "He made a mistake, yes, but does that mean he deserves to lose everything? His career, his reputation, his freedom? Is that justice?" Their young daughter, Emily, struggled to understand why her father suddenly seemed so distant. Before the incident, Mark had been the kind of dad who coached her soccer team and read bedtime stories every night. Now he was preoccupied, often lost in thought or distracted by the weight of his impending sentence. One evening, after overhearing classmates mock her at school, Emily tearfully asked her mother, "Why does everyone hate Daddy?" That question broke Sarah's heart. It also hardened her resolve to fight back against the narrative being painted about her husband. Together with Mark's defense attorney, she launched a small campaign to humanize him, sharing photos and stories that highlighted his dedication to serving his community. They released a video montage set to soft piano music, featuring clips of Mark volunteering at charity events, helping elderly neighbors shovel snow, and laughing with colleagues at precinct holiday parties. The caption read simply, "This is the real Mark Reynolds." While the effort garnered some sympathy, it also drew criticism from those who viewed it as an attempt to whitewash the severity of his actions. Critics argued that portraying Mark as a good guy undermined the larger conversation about accountability in law enforcement. "It's not about whether he's a nice person," one activist tweeted. "It's about whether he followed proper procedure." And clearly he didn't. As the trial approached its conclusion, the media frenzy reached a fever pitch. Journalists camped outside the courthouse, jockeying for position to get the best shot of Mark entering and exiting the building. Camera flashes blinded him each time he stepped outside, forcing him to shield his eyes as he navigated the gauntlet of reporters shouting questions. Inside the courtroom, spectators packed the benches, eager to witness firsthand how the saga would end. Some came out of genuine curiosity. Others hoped to see Mark punished for what they saw as reckless behavior. Throughout it all, Mark remained stoic, though those close to him could see the cracks beginning to show. He stopped sleeping soundly, haunted by nightmares of the supermarket standoff. During quiet moments, he stared blankly at the wall, replaying the events in his mind and wondering how things might have unfolded differently. What if he had waited just a few seconds longer before drawing his gun? What if he had asked Carter directly for identification instead of assuming the worst? Even as the verdict loomed, Mark found himself grappling with a strange sense of clarity. The relentless media coverage had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths, not just about himself, but about the institution he had dedicated his life to serving. He realized that public trust in law enforcement wasn't something that could be taken for granted. It had to be earned day by day through actions rather than words. And now, thanks to his own mistakes, that trust had been shaken. For him personally and for countless others who wore badges like his. When the jury finally delivered its guilty verdict, the courtroom fell silent. Mark sat motionless, his face unreadable as the judge announced his 3-year prison sentence. Outside, cheers erupted from some members of the crowd, while others sobbed openly. Reporters scrambled to capture reactions, pushing microphones toward anyone willing to comment. For a brief moment, chaos reigned once again. But as Mark was led away in handcuffs, he allowed himself a small measure of hope. No matter how bleak things seemed right now, he knew this wasn't the end of his story. Somewhere amidst the wreckage of his old life lay the seeds of redemption, and he was determined to find them no matter how long it took. The day Mark Reynolds walked into prison felt like stepping into a completely different world, one where the rules he had once enforced no longer applied. The heavy metal doors clanged shut behind him, echoing through the cold, gray corridors, as if sealing off his old life forever. Gone were the days when he wore a badge and commanded respect. Now, he was just another inmate, stripped of his identity and reduced to a number on a uniform. It was humbling, humiliating, and utterly disorienting. First, Mark struggled to adapt to the rigid routines of prison life. Every aspect of his existence was dictated by strict schedules, wake-up calls at dawn, meal times that left little room for delay, and mandatory head counts throughout the day. The lack of freedom gnawed at him. He wasn't used to being told what to do or having his every move monitored so closely. For someone who had spent years in positions of authority, this sudden loss of control was jarring. Simple tasks like folding laundry or lining up for breakfast became monumental challenges because they symbolized how far he had fallen. But it wasn't just the structure that made life difficult. It was the people. Inmates came from all walks of life, many with stories far darker than Mark's own. Some were hardened criminals serving long sentences for violent offenses, while others were non-violent offenders caught in the same system that had swallowed Mark whole. At first, Mark kept to himself, avoiding eye contact and staying out of conversations. He knew better than to trust anyone too quickly, especially given his background as a cop. Word spreads fast in prison, and it didn't take long for everyone to learn who Mark was, or rather, who he had been. Some inmates treated him with open hostility, muttering insults under their breath or giving him icy stares during meals. "You're one of them," one man sneered during lunch, jabbing a finger toward Mark. "A pig." Others simply ignored him, leaving him isolated in a sea of faces that seemed indifferent to his presence. Mark understood why. He represented everything they resented about the justice system. To them, he wasn't a victim of circumstance. He was part of the machine that had put them behind bars. Despite the tension, there were moments of unexpected kindness. A few inmates approached, Mark cautiously curious about his story. One older man named Reggie, who was serving time for a minor drug offense, struck up a conversation while they were both working in the laundry room. "So you're the famous cop, huh?" Reggie said with a wry smile. "Must be weird ending up on this side of the fence." Mark hesitated before responding. Talking about his past was painful, but something about Reggie's tone put him at ease. Over time, they developed an unlikely friendship. Reggie shared stories about his childhood in a rough neighborhood and how easily one bad decision could spiral out of control. Listening to these accounts gave Mark a new perspective on the lives of the men around him. They weren't just statistics or case files. They were human beings with struggles and regrets, much like himself. Reggie also introduced Mark to other inmates who were willing to share their experiences. There was Marcus, a young father sentenced for burglary, who dreamed of reuniting with his kids someday. Then there was Tony, a former white-collar worker convicted of embezzlement, who talked passionately about reforming the financial industry after his release. Each story added layers to Mark's understanding of the criminal justice system, how flawed it was, yet how full of potential for change. These interactions forced Mark to confront uncomfortable truths about his own career. As a police officer, he had always believed he was on the right side of the law, fighting for justice and protecting innocent people. But now, surrounded by individuals whose lives had been shaped, and often shattered, by that same system, he began to see things differently. He realized how easy it was to judge others without truly understanding their circumstances. How many times had he arrested someone without stopping to ask why they'd ended up in trouble? How often had he dismissed their stories as excuses instead of listening with empathy? This newfound awareness weighed heavily on Mark, but it also motivated him to make the most of his time in prison. Determined to prove that he wasn't beyond redemption, he threw himself into rehabilitation programs offered by the facility. He attended anger management classes, participated in group therapy sessions, and even joined a writing workshop where inmates expressed themselves through poetry and essays. Writing became a form of catharsis for Mark, allowing him to process his emotions and reflect on his journey. One poem he wrote, titled "Behind Bars," captured the pain and hopelessness of losing his freedom, as well as the glimmer of optimism he still clung to. Behind these walls, I've lost my name, reduced to numbers in a game. Yet somewhere, deep inside remains a spark that seeks to break these chains. Mark's participation in these programs earned him some measure of respect among his fellow inmates. Slowly but surely, the hostility toward him began to fade. While he would never fully escape the stigma of being a former cop, he found ways to connect with others on a human level. By sharing his vulnerabilities and acknowledging his mistakes, he showed that he was more than just a badge, and that helped bridge the gap between him and the men he lived alongside. Outside of structured activities, Mark spent hours reflecting on his future. What would happen when he got out? Could he rebuild his life after such a public fall from grace? These questions haunted him, but they also pushed him to think creatively about his next steps. He considered pursuing work in private security, or perhaps volunteering with organizations focused on criminal justice reform. Whatever path he chose, he vowed to use his experience to help others avoid the pitfalls he had encountered. One day, during a particularly intense therapy session, the facilitator asked each participant to describe one thing they wanted to achieve upon release. When it was Mark's turn, he spoke honestly. "I want to make amends, not just for what I did, but for the way I used to think. I want to help fix the problems I once contributed to." His words resonated with the group, sparking a lively discussion about accountability and second chances. For the first time in months, Mark felt a sense of purpose. Prison hadn't broken him. It had reshaped him. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, he was ready to face it head-on, with humility, determination, and a renewed commitment to doing better. As weeks turned into months, Mark continued to grow. He learned patience, resilience, and the importance of self-reflection. Most importantly, he discovered that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it and using those lessons to create a brighter future. Though his sentence was far from over, Mark felt a quiet sense of peace knowing that he was becoming a better version of himself, one day at a time.